The first plasma blast from the stars instantly vaporized the fill-up, free shower neon sign, sending scalding pink glass shards raining down like a monsoon onto Wyoming's 20 below permafrost. Night shift manager Brenda didn't even drop the Marlboro dangling from her lips. She just squinted through the grease-stained diner window at the matte black alien heavy dropship currently crushing diesel pump number 4 into scrap metal. All right then, she sighed, casually snatching the CBPA mic from behind the counter. Looks like the lot lizards are feeling extra feisty tonight, boys. Outside, a squad of alien shock troopers in frost blue power armor advanced with energy rifles raised, fanning out across the snow-choked lot full of heavy rigs, aiming to seize this vital Interstate 80 logistics hub with overwhelming force. But what they didn't know was that inside the cabs of those idling 18-wheeler Peterbilts, 42 American long-haul truckers, pissed off to high heaven about the blizzard road closures, were quietly setting down their day-old coffee and reaching under their seats for tire irons, pipe wrenches, and Remington shotguns. The raspy voice of veteran trucker Grizzly crackled over the radio. "Keep my hot dog warm, Brenda. I'm gonna go sort out these double-parking sons of bitches." Brenda, cigarette still bobbing, thumbed the PA's all-band lock switch and clicked it all the way down. Her gravelly smoker's voice instantly blasted from every speaker across the rest stop. "Service bay, lot, everybody move. Every pane of glass and every pump these trespassing scumbags wreck is coming straight out of their hides to settle the tab." She slammed the mic back into its cradle. Her left hand, stained with coffee and motor oil, reached straight into the grease-caked hollow under the register. Her fingertips immediately brushed the grip of her Remington, wrapped in 3 layers of electrical tape, the trusty old friend that had helped her handle stick-up kids and drunks for a decade on the night shift. She hauled the scattergun up, planted it on the counter, hooked the webbing of her right hand over the worn pump action, racked it back, and slammed it forward. Clack. A shiny brass 00 buckshot shell seated firmly in the chamber, the firing pin locked in, and the safety click to fire. Huddled in the diner's corner were 3 hotshot freight drivers waiting out the storm. A minute ago they were shaking with their hands over their heads under the booths. Now they were all pulling. 38 revolvers from their waistbands, knuckles turning white on the grips. The sub-zero winds howled through the window seams, rattling the curled edges of the menu board above the counter. The glass itself started humming in resonance with the approaching footsteps outside. The stench of raw diesel mixed with the biting cold seeped in, burning their noses, spillover from Pump 4, courtesy of the alien dropship's landing. The crunch of power armor stomping hardpack ice drew closer, finally halting right outside the main doors. 1 second of dead silence. Nothing but the whistling blizzard and the low, throaty rumble of 42 idling heavy rigs out in the lot. Then, a blinding tangerine flash flared through the door seams, followed by a deafening boom that made every ceramic coffee mug jump on the counter. The entire 3-centimeter thick storm glass and its welded steel frame were blown into a million pieces by the Vise Expeditionary Force's kinetic breaching charge. Freezing snow, gunpowder smoke, and diesel exhaust instantly flooded the diner. The blizzard blew Brenda's half-smoked Marlboro flat against her cheek, instantly snuffing the cherry. She tilted her head to shake out the glass shards from her collar, leveled the shotgun, and narrowed her eyes. Just in time to see the first frost-blue shoulder pauldron emerge through the billowing smoke of the shattered doorway. Czar stepped through the ruined frame first, his armored boots grinding over tempered glass. The overpowering stench of hydrocarbons, mixed with the sickeningly sweet scent of fried starchy tubers, overloaded his helmet sensors, making them whine. As the most elite shock troop commander in the Vise Expeditionary Force, he anticipated scattering, screaming civilians clutching their heads. Instead, the diner was lit only by a single dim tungsten bulb above the register. Empty tables and chairs were knocked askew in the aisles, and there wasn't a single trembling breath to be heard. "Fan out." Purge all biological targets. Zar barked into the comms, raising a hand to recalibrate his thermal visor. The HUD was flooded with waste heat signatures, all latent thermal bleed from those crude iron monoliths idling in the parking lot. He couldn't isolate a single biological silhouette. Behind him, 6 shock troopers adopted combat spacing. The blue energy cores of their plasma rifles lit up one by one, sweeping beams across the dark booths. A crude, chemically ignited muzzle flash erupted from behind the register. A half-pound steel flare slug, carrying massive kinetic energy, punched dead into the energy generator on Zar's chest. His energy shield flared to life with a loud hum, but it was fundamentally incapable of stopping a low-velocity, high-mass projectile. A piercing overload alarm instantly shrieked in Zar's ears. The servos in his back contorted violently. He was launched backward out the doorframe as if struck by a siege hammer, crashing heavily onto the blizzard-swept asphalt. Zar tumbled twice, his visor scraping sparks off the black ice. His chest plate's energy bar plummeted by 2/3. The comms channel was instantly saturated with the panicked shouts of his squad. 3 plasma bolts immediately vaporized half the diner counter, sending sawdust flying everywhere. Zar pushed against the ice, trying to heave himself up, his mind completely reeling from cognitive dissonance. Why did a primitive chemical combustion weapon bypass a standard vis energy shield? Why aren't these indigenous life forms fleeing? The idle rumbling of diesel engines across the entire lot vibrated through the ice, rattling his armor's joints. Suddenly, that low, muffled thrum roared to a deafening pitch, vibrating the packed snow right off the ice. Zar snapped his head up. From the depths of the pitch-black lot, 2 blinding golden pillars of light cleaved through the darkness. The beams swept over Zar's scorching chest plate, slicing through the heavy swirling snow, and deadlocked onto the entire Vice Expeditionary Shock Squad. Up in the cab, Grizzly tucked his grease-stained chin into his fleece collar, a dead stogie jutting from the corner of his mouth. The explosion had blown his afternoon nap completely to hell. "Motherfucking alien strays, messin' with my rest hours," he growled. His left foot slammed the clutch to the floor. His calloused palm gripped the stick and slammed it hard into granny gear. The 16-liter Cummins diesel engine exploded into a guttural roar, rattling the windows of the entire 18-wheeler. Thick, scalding black exhaust belched from the chrome stacks, instantly turning the back half of the lot into a chaotic whiteout. He popped the air brakes and put his right boot completely through the floorboard. The heavily modified Peterbilt surged forward with a low growl. Heavy-duty steer tires, welded with anti-slip track chains, chewed through the hard-packed crust, violently spraying ice chunks up against the mudguards. 40 tons of rolling American steel charged like a moving mountain, carried by the roar of its diesel heart, barreling straight toward the alien phalanx forming up at the diner doors. The Vice shock troopers frantically squeezed their plasma rifle triggers. Indigo high-energy beams raked across the truck's cast-iron bull bar, managing nothing but a few scorched, shallow dents. They couldn't even chew through the primer. They scrambled to deploy portable shield generators, but the neon blue energy domes were only half expanded before the heavy rig's steel bumper violently plowed into the edge of their formation. The tire chains literally ground 2 deployed shield generators into the snow. Precision energy components were instantly pulverized into a glued mess of scrap metal. Blue-purple energy sparks violently popped and crackled, showering the snow. The massive momentum scattered the troopers like pins. Silver-gray power armor clanged sharply against the rolling steel hull. 3 soldiers were swatted away entirely, crashing into snowbanks, unable to move a muscle. The titanic impact threw Zar another half-meter backward. He gripped the handle of his smoking, overloaded energy generator, his claws splintering and bleeding, pushing against the frozen crust to heave his upper body off the ground. The solid ice dug painfully into Zar's split nails. Forcing power into his grounded arm, he forcefully tore his torso free from the ice. The left shoulder pauldron of his power armor bore a gouge half a finger deep from the truck's chains. The crater on his chest plate from the crude indigenous flare was still radiating heat. Comms were completely flooded with blizzard static. The 3 troopers buried in the snowbanks were calling out intermittently, reporting that ice shards had wedged into their armor joints. The extreme sub-zero temperatures had flash-frozen their appendages, rendering them completely paralyzed. Tsar gritted his mandibles and shook his head to clear it. Re-engaging his helmet's thermal imaging suite, he had to immediately acquire a lock on that rampaging human-heavy transport and call in orbital fire. The exact second his claw tapped the helmet dial, a blast of 500-degree diesel exhaust, thick with ice crystals, slammed directly into his optical visor. The pristine green tactical grid instantly bloomed into blinding, searing white. Overload klaxons immediately shrieked inside his helm, and the acrid, sizzling stench of fried optical sensors flooded his respiratory tracts. He frantically smashed the manual override for auxiliary optics. With every strike, the klaxon's pitch ratcheted up a notch, but his vision remained a lethal, blinding white. Wave after wave of raw diesel soot belched from the truck's exhaust stacks. Paired with the ambient light scattering off the swirling blizzard, it catastrophically jammed every single sensor suite. He couldn't differentiate a target half a meter away. Before deployment, Commander Sar had declared that primitive human weapons couldn't even scratch the deflection layers of their energy shields. Yet, when that 40-ton chunk of iron barreled through, 2 portable shield generators didn't last 10 seconds before being ground into plastic confetti under its treads. Tsar's fingertips finally found the grip of his plasma rifle holstered at his hip. He whipped it up, aiming blindly into the deafening engine roar. Right at that moment, 10 paces to his flank, the deep, groaning screech of metal hinges popping open echoed from the back doors of a refrigerated shipping container. The hinges violently snapped. The rust-red doors of the reefer unit were kicked wide open by a massive steel-toed work boot, slamming into the knee-deep snow and sending up an explosive geyser of ice and diesel soot. Big Mike shoved half his bulk out of the container. His heavy Carhartt jacket, caked with grease and weld splatter, snapped in the blizzard wind. His massive shoulders were literally a size wider than the Vi's expeditionary power armor. He was dragging a high-pressure air hose mummified in duct tape, trailing a 3-foot, heavy-duty pneumatic impact wrench still slick with yesterday's gear oil. Inside the container, a portable industrial air compressor chugged with a low, throaty rumble, hoarding a massive payload of PSI. Squinting through the driving snow, he scanned the absolute clusterfuck of a parking lot. Completely blind, Tsar was swaying in place with his plasma rifle raised. 3 shock troopers were buried waist-deep in collapsed snowbanks, arms so frozen they couldn't even lift them. And 1 isolated trooper was blindly shuffling along the wall, his helmet optics completely gunked up by exhaust, relying entirely on comms to navigate, his boots crunching loudly in the snow. Mike didn't make a sound. He hunched over and flanked around. His steel toes sank into the powder without making a whisper. The straggler trooper didn't even notice the massive shadow looming behind him. 3 steps, and Mike was right on his 6. His ham-sized left hand clamped down hard on the alien's power armor pauldron, pinning it. His right-hand precision guided the impact wrench socket, straight into the microscopic locking seam at the base of the helmet. The gap was barely wide enough to slide a business card into, but the socket seated perfectly. His thumb completely flattened the trigger. 1,300 foot-pounds of torque exploded instantly. The impact wrench roared like a demon, venting high-pressure air fiercely into the snow. The precision titanium alloy locking pins instantly twisted into spaghetti. Following a sharp crack, the entire cervical locking valve was ripped out by the roots. The trooper couldn't even choke out a full scream before the power node severed, dropping him face down into the snowbank like a felled tree. Mike casually snatched the plasma rifle from the alien's limp grip, the scalding chassis searing against his grease-slicked palm. The static-laced death shriek ripped through the open comms channel, detonating inside Tsar's headset. The abrupt, horrifying scream nearly hemorrhaged his inner ear. He white-knuckled his plasma rifle and roared into the comms, "All units form up. Maximize energy shields, full overload." Pale blue energy shields whined as they deployed, encasing every remaining Vice shock trooper's armor. A split second later, a fist-sized chunk of ice, kicked up by the rig's exhaust vortex, hurtled toward the trooper on the far left. The shield failed to trigger a deflection. The block of ice punched through the energy dome like it was melting butter, smashing dead center into the trooper's thermal visor. The faceplate instantly shattered into a dense spiderweb pattern. The soldier didn't even register a warning ping before face-planting straight into the knee-deep powder. Next came the sharp shriek of heavy metal slicing through the blizzard. The duct-taped impact wrench, carrying nearly 100 pounds of raw mass, slammed brutally into the cervical armor seam of the second trooper. The energy shield flickered once, completely failing to deflect the blow. With a sickening crunch, the immense torque snapped the locking valve. The helmet, along with half the alien cervical spine, launched into the air, spraying pale blue alien blood across the snow and blooming into a macabre, neon blue stain. Tsar's primary cardiovascular organ seized hard. This was fundamentally wrong. How could the absolute scales of technological supremacy tilt in reverse? Why was a shield matrix designed to deflect hypervelocity plasma unable to stop a few chunks of frozen water and a battered manual labor tool? He frantically mashed the sensor reboot cycle, painfully purging the whiteout from his HUD pixel by pixel, until he could piece together a barely coherent image. Surrounding the entire perimeter of the lot were the monolithic, black steel silhouettes of heavy diesel haulers. Their idling engines vibrated the ice shelf so violently it shuddered, and the towering behemoth wielding the venting pneumatic wrench was slowly flanking his position. Tsar snapped his head up, his throat aggressively swallowing. Atop the roofs of the 42 heavy rigs in the lot, row after row of light bars and spotlights were dead, aimed at his coordinates. The dark lenses glinted with a cold, predatory reflection, just waiting for the command. Grizzly kicked his size 12 work boots up onto the Peterbilt's dented dash. His thick thumb clicked the CB dial straight to channel 19. Pressing the talk button, the dry half-stogie in his mouth bobbed gently with the engine idle. He had just crushed 2 shield generators, half a panel of alien power armor was still snagged on his bull bar, and the ambient heat from the diesel block kept the cab toasty warm while the blizzard hammered against the windshield. To all my over-the-road gear jammers, he spat a flake of tobacco at the mic, his voice raspy enough to strip rust off iron. Light 'em up. Bzzz. The roof array of the lead Kenworth ignited first, a blinding white flare that instantly shredded the lot's darkness. Then, in a massive chain reaction, the light bars, high beams, and spotlights of 42 diesel rigs fired up simultaneously. Hundreds of beams, pushing over 20,000 kilowatts of pure luminescence, speared into the center of the lot like a barrage of white-hot steel blades, pinning the Vias squad. The entire lot was flooded with daylight intensity illumination. Even the falling snowflakes glared like suspended shards of glass. Every rig's massive engine maintained a throaty, threatening idle. Boiling exhaust from the stacks whipped the snow into churning, blinding white clouds illuminated by the floods. The ground thrummed violently with the RPMs, and the rest stop windows rattled aggressively. The overcharged energy shields of Tsar's squad were drenched in white light, refracting a bizarre blue-purple halo that silhouetted the remaining troopers dead in the center of the kill zone. Grizzly flicked his ash. The ember landed on his oil-stained work pants, but he didn't bother brushing it off. He just squinted at the blinding cluster of aliens, his fingers already resting heavy on the air horn lanyard. Hundreds of high-intensity lumen beams completely flooded the multi-lens thermal optics of Tsar and his surviving squad. The blistering barrage of light slammed head-on into Tsar's visor. The fizzing crackle of electrical shorts popped inside his headset as the ultra-precise optical sensors literally melted down, instantly followed by the sharp crack of the glass faceplate imploding. Shattered glass and molten plastic slag blasted straight into Tsar's optic stalks. The excruciating agony dropped him to his knees in the ankle-deep powder with a muffled groan. Beside him, the 3 remaining Vis troopers erupted into agonizing shrieks. Black, greasy smoke billowed from all their shattered visors. The entire squad was completely, irreversibly blinded. Grinding his mandibles, Tsar blindly groped for the comms unit on his lower back, his claws scraping uselessly against the cold metal casing, roaring the order to fire at will. Totally blind, he could only squeeze the trigger of his plasma rifle toward the deafening roar of the diesel blocks. Crimson-blue superheated plasma bolts screamed out, slamming dead center into the cast-iron engine block of a nearby Peterbilt. It merely chewed through a layer of old enamel, leaving a pathetically shallow scorch mark. It didn't even cause a hairline fracture in the block. Chaotic, suppressing fire erupted everywhere. Crimson-blue beams ricocheted wildly across the lot. Plasma swept across the snow, instantly boiling massive clouds of scalding steam. It raked the corrugated tin roof of the pump station, merely melting a few tiny holes with curled edges. It blasted gravel into literal vapor, but not a single shot connected with the humans hunkered behind their rigs. The idling thunder of 42 heavy diesels hammered against Tsar's chest plate like thousands of sledgehammers, vibrating his internal organs into mush. He shoved off his armor's knee servos and slowly stood up, boots scraping through the loose snow. His earpieces were flooded with chaotic sobbing and screaming. Nobody could pinpoint the enemy. Nobody could find an exfiltration vector. Gripping his overheating rifle, Tsar used the direction of the biting wind to orient himself toward the diner, braced the stock, aimed blind, and was just about to pull the trigger again. Through the blizzard, just inside the ruined diner doors, Brenda's leatherwork boots crunched over shattered tempered glass. A wildly blind-fired plasma bolt sheared past her bangs, blowing a smoking, charred hole straight through the plywood menu board behind her. She ducked low and scurried along the baseboards, hip-firing her Remington to dodge the erratic energy blasts, before ducking behind a concrete pylon at the top of the loading dock ramp. The swirling snow and raw diesel fumes whipped down her collar. The 42 rigs were still running their floods, lighting up the entire ramp like high noon. A 55-gallon drum of waste-heavy motor oil sat right at her boots, left over from Big Mike's oil change last week. She counted the cooldown cycle on the alien plasma rifles, 3 seconds. Plenty of time. She threw her shoulder against the rim and tipped it hard. Thick, black-brown viscous sludge cascaded down the 15-degree decline, washing over the snow, filling the concrete cracks, and painting a perfectly slick, uniform oil slick. She hopped half a step back, leveled the scattergun, and aimed dead at the brass firing pin of the wall-mounted fire hydrant next to the ramp. Boom! The recoil punched her shoulder blade numb. The glass housing shattered into fragments, and a massive geyser of high-pressure cold water erupted, blasting down over the oil and snow. Sub-0 27-degree winds slashed across it. The frigid water began flash freezing the second it hit the supercooled concrete. In less than 10 seconds, the entire sloped ramp became a sheet of black ice laced with motor oil, so impossibly slick it couldn't even catch a stray snowflake. Brenda wiped the sludge off her hands, thumbed another buckshot shell into the tube, and leaned against the pylon, listening closely. Tsar's massive power-armored boots planted heavily onto the oil-slicked black ice of the decline ramp. His boot treads, utterly reliant on electromagnetic adhesion for traction, instantly slipped sideways. A catastrophic zero-friction feedback loop slammed into Tsar's neural interface. The ruptured optical sensors on his helm were still weeping molten thermal paste. His totally blind vision was nothing but dead black, his ears ringing with calm static and squadmate agony. Calling low-orbit gunship. Requesting grav-tether exfil and full orbital bombardment on all mobile targets in this sector. He screamed into the mic. His armored claws gouged at the concrete retaining wall, sparking wildly, but he was completely unable to stop himself from sliding down the ramp. Following his lead, the 3 surviving troopers stepped onto the ice. Toting literal tons of power armor and overloaded energy cores, the squad went down like bowling pins, careening down the hyper-slick ramp one after another. The harsh clanking of colliding shoulder plates and the metallic clatter of dropped plasma rifles sliding over ice, all masked by the howling blizzard, flooded Zar's audio receptors, giving him a massive cerebral hemorrhage. He violently redlined his mag boots, completely rebooting the locomotive systems. But the viscous motor oil totally insulated the electromagnetic contact points. No matter how much juice he pumped in, his soles just spun furiously on the black ice, failing to snag even a fraction of traction. The squad violently slammed into the heavy steel barricade of the enclosed trash compactor unit, kicking up a massive cloud of snow and rotten garbage. They were boxed in on 3 sides by cold, hardened carbon steel, leaving only the loading chute exposed to the storm. Leaning on his caved-in chest plate, Zar barely managed to prop himself up, boots still uselessly slipping. He received no confirmation from the gunship. Instead, just outside the chute, he heard a heavier, deeper diesel roar slowly creeping toward them. Warm yellow headlights pierced the blizzard, creeping inch by inch up his oil-splattered chest armor. The 14-liter diesel engine of the municipal snowplow idled so hard it shook rust flakes right off the compactor's steel walls. Big Mike wiped the ice off his face, jammed the captured plasma rifle under his massive arm, and shoved it straight against the lip of the plow blade. He clamped the arc welder down. Showered in a crackling storm of blue-white sparks, he didn't even bother calibrating the sights. 3 massive, sloppy weld beads instantly fused the gun chassis straight to the steel plating. Who cared about accuracy? It was just a bonus. Single-use boomstick. He stomped the transmission gear. The snowplow's rubber tracks bit through the oily ice, grinding forward. Inside the compactor bay, the blind Vise troopers frantically pulled their triggers. Orange-red beams sparked off the dozer blade, leaving nothing but barely visible smudge marks on the heavy steel. Their mag boots couldn't grip. Their overloaded cores locked up their servos. All they could do was flail around in the sludge, clutching their rifles and emitting piercing, high-frequency shrieks. The plow blade slammed ruthlessly into the back wall of the compactor. Hydraulics whined, tilting the bucket up, lifting several tons of hard-pack ice, along with the 4 remaining Vise shock troopers. Chunks of ice cascaded through the gaps in the bucket. Mike popped it into low gear and inched forward 5 meters. The maw of the industrial refuse shredder sat directly under the bucket. Its razor-sharp alloy steel rotors were already spinning at maximum RPM, screaming with a deafening metallic shriek, spitting pulverized rust and ice chips everywhere. Right at that exact second, the howling storm above was abruptly torn apart by a pale blue anti-gravity beam. The Vise expeditionary gunship had just broken the cloud layer, hovering dead steady 100 meters above the empty side of the lot. Its grav tether beam was already spinning up and glowing. Grizzly tapped his knuckles twice against the CB mic. The storm shoved diesel fumes through the cracks of his Peterbilt cab, making him spit a wad of tar-laced phlegm. Units 17, 29, 46. Drop it in Granny, hammer down and hit that son of a bitch's anti-grav engine in a flying V formation. The channel dial clicked shut. 3 massive tractor trailers, each pushing over 70 feet and fully loaded with raw hardwood timber, roared to life. Turbochargers shrieked like banshees. Boiling black exhaust pumped into the squall. The massive 120 valve blocks shook the ice to powder. Their steer tires savagely bit into the slushy, oily black ice, slipping for just a half second before finding dead traction. The three steel leviathans formed up into a perfect wedge coming off the loading ramp. Their headlights and roof arrays maxed out simultaneously, throwing thousands of lumens straight at the Vice gunship 100 meters away. The gunship's exterior sensors immediately erupted with proximity warnings. However, its energy shields were strictly calibrated to deflect high-yield radiation. It didn't even process 80 tons of rolling terrestrial iron as a viable threat vector. The tractor beam maintained a serene, pale blue hue, slowly pulling Commander Czar out from the ice of the trash compactor, hoisting him steadily toward the airlock. Grizzly buried the accelerator straight through the floorboard. The tachometer slammed into the red line with a loud clack. Chomping his dead Marlboro, his massive thumb crushed the air horn trigger. The deafening metallic blast instantly shattered the blizzard. The remaining tempered glass around the lot violently exploded from its frames. Tons of snow avalanched off the station roofs. The three rigs pushed 70 miles an hour, raw timber payloads driving their momentum, aligning their cold, hardened steel grills squarely with the blue glow of the gunship's anti-grav nacelle plowing across the ice. At 30 meters from the hull, the displaced air pressure began screaming. The exact second Czar's boots touched down on the wavering energy field of the tether, the skull-splitting blast of the air horn slammed through his helmet. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of energy weapons, but the devastating low-frequency boom of 400 tons of raw wood and American steel. His delicate tympanic membranes instantly ruptured. Hot blood rushed down his ear canals into his throat, the coppery taste making him choke. Half of his helmet's optical suite was totally glassed by the spotlights, but the remaining half let in enough hazy white light to clearly outline the nightmare. Three monolithic haulers packed in a wedge formation, high beams blinding, grinding over the ice straight for the belly of the ship. 10 meters. 5 meters. The gunship's shield array shrieked an overload warning. The pale blue energy barrier flickered against the heavy grills, failing to even slow them down. Every VIS shock trooper was acutely aware of the fatal flaw in their shield tech, but literally nobody could have ever predicted that primitive planetary locals would weaponize a convoy of industrial heavy machinery, throwing hundreds of tons of absolute mass straight at their goddamn faces. An apocalyptic impact ensued. The colossal shockwave blasted Czar's grip clean off the energy tether. 120 millimeters of anti-grav engine plating was peeled back like a tin can. Inertia drove the fully loaded hardwood trunk straight into the engine bay, crushing the hyper-advanced anti-grav generator into a twisted wad of scrap. Ruptured fuel lines erupted in blue flame, licking up the mangled hull. The entire gunship instantly lost lift and plummeted, yawing violently before crashing onto the ice. Czar slid wildly down the pitched hull, his mag boots completely failing to grip the oil-slicked chassis. He crashed brutally into a warped piece of engine plating, snapping 2 ribs. Even drawing breath brought the blinding agony of grinding bone fragments. Through the blood-smeared haze of his remaining eye, he looked down the storm-swept lot. There, hovering steadily at the end of the blizzard, was a tiny, flickering orange ember, pointed dead aimed at the gaping wound in the engine bay. The sleet stung Brenda's wind-chapped cheeks. She gnawed on her dead cigarette butt, pinching the flickering orange flame to keep it steady. Her other hand white-knuckled an empty whiskey bottle totally topped off with premium unleaded, the same bottle those biker punks smashed on her register yesterday. The oil-soaked rag jammed in the neck was crackling, radiating scorching heat against the back of her hand. Standing at the peak of the loading ramp, she stared down at the crippled gunship listing in the ice crater. The shattered anti-grav bay was gaping wide open like a dark canyon. Sporadic blind fire still spat from the wreck. A pale blue plasma bolt whizzed past her ear, melting a smoking crater right into the diner's brick wall behind her. Trashed Pump 4, Busted my doors and had the brass to blow out my goddamn front glass, Brenda muttered. Torsioning her core, she launched the Molotov. The tangerine fireball arced beautifully through the storm, zeroed in, and dropped right into the gaping maw of the engine bay. 3 seconds of dead silence. Nothing but the thrum of 40 idling rigs and the howling blizzard sweeping the lot. Then, a muffled boom detonated deep inside the gunship's gut. Leaking plasma conduit fuel and residual hydrogen violently combusted with the gasoline, violently erupting from every single breach in the hull. Warped armor plating was blown 50 feet in the air by the shockwave. A half-ton slab slammed directly into the neighboring pump canopy, totally decapitating an already leaning diesel pump. Brenda swore out loud again, flicked her dead cigarette into a snowbank, and rested her hand on the cold stock of her Remington, watching the gunship's skeleton slowly buckle and collapse. Flying sparks painted the blizzard-swept lot blood red. The blistering metal chassis groaned and warped against the black ice, a slurry of meltwater and burning engine oil spreading across the tarmac. Up in the stratosphere, the Vise expeditionary mothership's optical reconnaissance suite finally pierced the atmospheric storm interference, feeding a crystal-clear broadcast of that churning, burning fireball directly into the bridge's main holoscreen. The very next second, Supreme Commander Sar's compound eyes locked onto the detonation, and his chitinous knuckles locked completely rigid. Barely a microcycle ago, he was chuckling with his tacticians about how pacifying this primitive, fossil fuel-burning rock would only take a single shock squad to wipe out a border settlement. Now, the shockwave of twisted titanium shrapnel was washing over the holoscreen, and the vitals of 12 elite shock troopers on the comms roster were flatlining one after another. Shield drones and portable generators were completely neutralized. The rapid response gunship had literally just been reduced to slag in a catastrophic magazine detonation. SAR reached out, drastically slowing the optical playback, sweeping frame by grueling frame. A 40-ton diesel transport plowing right into their formation. Energy shields completely failing to deflect, shattering instantly. The sickening crunch of steel treads obliterating generators echoed over the feed, actually vibrating the bridge viewports. Hundreds of concentrated lumen beams sweeping the field, Flash frying his elite squad's optical sensors into glass dust. Oil-slicked ice totally stripping mag boots of traction. Troopers tumbling like sport pins into a refuse compressor. A massive hyper-torque pneumatic tool ripping helmet valves clean off, painting the snow glaringly, horrifyingly red. SAR's respiration spiked drastically. His proud, absolute technological supremacy was tissue paper against these primitive locals armed with garage tools. Shields couldn't stop low-velocity heavy iron. Sensors couldn't handle raw vehicular lumens. Power armor couldn't even maintain bipedal balance on an iced oil slick. He had been indoctrinated since birth that technological superiority guaranteed total dominance over lesser civilizations. Now, his entire cognitive reality was cascading into catastrophic failure, his digits shivering violently. His hand, originally hovering over the orbital bombardment authorization key, shook so uncontrollably he couldn't depress it. The bridge tacticians were petrified statues. Nobody dared make a sound. Only the raw crackle of dead comms static filled the room. SAR's hand swept across the console, subconsciously initializing the astral navigation charts. His trembling claw reached for the crimson quarantine tag, fully prepared to designate this rock as a permanent, galactic empire-wide dead zone. In the bottom right corner of the main display, a real-time optical pop-up fed in. A monstrous Peterbilt hauler, completely caked in ice and crude oil, was parked right next to the smoldering crater. Its massive diesel block was still chugging aggressively. The cab door was sealed shut, the chrome grille reflecting the dying fires of the gunship. Screech! The heavy Peterbilt door was violently kicked open with brute force. A frost-caked work boot stepped out, crushing the remnants of the gunship hull and making the wreckage vibrate. Grizzly stepped out, a 3-foot crowbar slathered in grease, swinging lazily in his hand. His face was dusted with soot from the magazine detonation. Fleece collar popped against his neck, his breath flashed freezing into crystals on his eyebrows. Buried under the wreckage, Czar was pinned at the waist by the anti-grav remnants. His slagged thermal visor hung diagonally off his gorget, exposing bloodshot compound eyes. The power armor's backup supply whined pathetically, emitting a few weak blue sparks across the plating, too dead to stop even a snowflake. Grizzly spat out a frozen wad of tobacco chew, slamming the heavy tip of the crowbar straight onto Czar's chest plate with a hollow metallic thud. "You little shit." Trashing the pumps, bending 3 of my goddamn parking bollards, and interrupting my legally mandated rest period. He hauled out a coiled yellow nylon rache strap from his belt, heavy-duty load binders meant for securing raw timber, thicker than a man's wrist, rated to snap a 100-year pine in half. He half-dragged, half-carried Czar around to the back of the cab. Scalding chrome exhaust stacks pumped heavy diesel fumes. Stray ice chips instantly vaporized on contact. The intense heat made Czar's armor sizzle and stink of ozone. In 2 quick loops, Grizzly cinched the strap dead tight, crushing Czar's chest generator into a whining overload, and secured it with a sailor's knot. "Consider yourself a new hood ornament for my rig. A little warning sign for any other stray mutts looking for trouble around here." The dozens of truckers gathering around completely lost it, roaring with laughter. Cigarette cherries bobbed in the dark. Somebody pulled a Polaroid and snapped pictures of the heavily bound alien, promising to tack it right up on the Interstate Truckers Union corkboard. Grizzly wiped the slush off his mug and tilted his head up, shooting a dead-eyed stare straight into the low-orbit night. The silver-gray Vice mothership hung perfectly still in the pitch black. Every single porthole was blazing, like a cluster of terrified eyes holding their breath. SAR's claw, coated in frost from the failing environmental controls, hovered over the frigid armor plating of the emergency hyperspace abort switch. His knuckle was completely white from sheer tension. The optical feed was permanently burned into his retinas, his absolute best, Commander Czar hogtied to the blistering exhaust pipe of a 40-ton diesel transport with crude yellow synthetic webbing, head slumped in the howling blizzard, his shattered power armor weeping contaminated meltwater. Before launch, he had openly mocked High Command's caution during strategy briefings, scoffing that a primitive species incapable of cold fusion required merely a token squad to conquer their border logistics nodes. Now all that arrogance was total dust. His gunship was a smoldering wreck. Portable generators were ground into aluminum shavings under crude tires. The absolute technological superiority his military worshipped was the galaxy's cruelest joke. Shields couldn't stop raw physical mass. Optic sensors were fried by vehicular headlights. Elite power armor couldn't stand upright on an oil-slicked decline. These primate truck drivers had literally weaponized elementary physics to pulverize his finest warriors into paste. His bridge lieutenant's voice quavered violently. "Supreme Commander, jump drives are spooled. Entire armada standing by for exfil." Czar bit completely through his synthetic cheek lining, his digit dropping like a stone directly onto the red abort switch. Blaring klaxons overwhelmed the bridge. All surface communications links were instantly completely severed. The blue shift halo of a hyperspace spool-up raced across the mothership's hull. Czar stared at the feed one last time. The roof floods of those 42 rigs were still blazing away. Like 42 iron leviathans crouching in the wasteland, breathing diesel, simply waiting for the next prey. The blizzard whipped the stench of blood and diesel across the rest stop, the dying heat of the gunship still baking the black ice. Brenda, still gripping her hot Remington, marched through the ankle-deep powder toward the grill of the truck, boots crunching over glass and alien alloy. She lifted her greasy work boot, planted it dead on Tsar's shattered breastplate, and dug her right hand into her coveralls. She whipped out a hand-written invoice absolutely crusted in coffee stains and crude oil. Slapping the hot scattergun behind her back, she dug her heel into the fractured remnants of his energy generator. The cold rubber sole ruthlessly ground down onto the exposed sensor cables, sparking wildly into the powder and instantly melting a dirty puddle. Grizzly was leaning against his Peterbilt's door, sparking up a Camel, the cherry flaring bright against the storm. Big Mike leaned over the compactor rail, casually twirling that massive pneumatic wrench, the heavy metallic swoosh completely drowning out the tight creak of Tsar's restraints. Pinned fast to the blistering chrome stack, the right half of Tsar's visor was completely glassed. The left side still functioned, its exposed optical lens shivering uncontrollably. Brenda leaned in and violently slapped that grease-soaked invoice straight onto his only working lens with a sharp smack. The paper soaked up the slush on the glass, bleeding out a massive dark brown diesel stain. "Time to settle up," Brenda grated out, her voice like sandpaper on iron. "When you freaks crashed the party, your plasma bullshit blew the head clean off my pump number 4. Brand new manifold unit runs 32 grand, 740. Plus hazardous cleanup labor. Tell you what, I'll waive the change. 32 grand flat." Static crackled deep inside Tsar's helmet. His translator matrix was struggling to decode the linguistics while combating severe cranial trauma. He had spent his entire military life indoctrinated in absolute technological dominance. He had prosecuted hundreds of planetary colonial drops. Not once in his existence had he been utterly defeated, captured, and then instantly billed for property damages. "Stripping the sensors and generators out of this fancy vise armor of yours and hawking 'em on the black market should just about cover the tab," Brenda said, pulling a ballpoint from her back pocket and aggressively scribbling a massive check mark at the bottom of the invoice. "With any luck, I'll clear a couple hundred extra. Enough to score a bottle of 12-year bourbon for my goddamn overtime pay." Far on the horizon, the pale purple slipstream scars left by the fleeing Vise Armada slowly melted into the pink-green auroras sweeping the Arctic sky. Beneath her boot, the manic twitching of Tsar's optic lens abruptly froze, glassing over entirely. Brenda folded the invoice, shoved it deep into her overalls, and snapped her fingers at Grizzly and Mike. "All right, break's over, boys. Strip the armor, fix the pump. We're opening for business by sunup." The blizzard carried the heavy scent of diesel across the rest stop. The deep, rumbling idle of dozens of heavy haulers echoed through the storm, beating like the unstoppable iron heart of this untamed continent.
Finishing this story leaves me with a very specific, visceral kind of satisfaction. In a sci-fi landscape that's often obsessed with incomprehensible hypertech, interdimensional threats, and galaxy-ending stakes, I wanted to bring things violently back down to Earth, literally down to the freezing, grease-stained permafrost of a Wyoming rest stop. I wanted to explore the raw, unpolished romance of pure physical mass colliding with blue-collar rage. The core contrast here is what makes the narrative so damn fun. A hyper-advanced alien strike force, absolutely convinced of their technological supremacy, picking a fight with a bunch of exhausted long-haul truckers who just want to finish their stale coffee and wait out a blizzard. There is something deeply satisfying about stripping away the high-concept magic and replacing it with a 16-liter Cummins diesel block and a pneumatic impact wrench. It's the ultimate reality check, watching delicate, hyper-advanced energy shields get completely pulverized by 40 tons of American steel, moving at 70 miles an hour. While putting this together, I wanted the audience to almost smell the raw diesel exhaust and feel the low-frequency rattle of those idling rigs vibrating in their chest. It's not just a story about humanity winning. It's a tribute to that stubborn, gritty, purely earthbound resilience. The kind of unapologetic grit that looks at an invading alien warlord and simply hands them a mechanic's invoice for property damage. I hope when you listen to this audio, you feel the kinetic energy of the scene, the grease on your hands, and that distinctly dark, deadpan humor.